Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, where today will be part 2 of our discussion of the Morgan affair.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our thoughts and opinions are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions via our website at theworkingtoolspodcast.com.
Today on the Working Tools Podcast, we have 3/4 of our usual hosts. I'm Matt Appel. I'm a member of Mill Creek Lodge number 243 here in Montlake Terrace, Washington. We have very worshipful brother David Colbeth from King Solomon number 60 in Auburn, Washington, and Craig Graham from Kalamalka Lodge number 160 up in British Columbia. And we are grateful to have with us again our guest from the last episode, very worshipful brother Jeremy Yielding, who's a member of Stilicum number 2 down Tacoma Way. So Jeremy, thank you for agreeing to be back on the show.
Yep.
And so we sort of left off last time at I guess we hadn't quite concluded
what happens next?
Exactly. The story of the film so far.
Where's my popcorn?
So we left off at about where the stuff had gotten published anyway, although actually we didn't talk about what happened to Morgan, which I guess is sort of the crux of the whole affair, is what various people believed happened to him.
So let me back up just a little bit. We're going to go back into August of 1826, where we start to see some. Actually, let's go back even a little further, back into July. So Morgan's debts start to catch up with him, and he starts to get arrested for those debts. So this is a time when judicially, if you owed somebody money, they could have you arrested and thrown in the hoosegow until you were able to make good on those debts. So Morgan is jailed a couple of times in July, and his partners in this book deal that he's got have to bail him out, and they do it a couple times. And Morgan is now seeing more and more of a liability to the eventual publishing of this of the secrets of Freemasonry here. And so we get into August. Morgan comes back and threatens that violence against his co-conspirators. So Dyer and Davids, and later another guy by the name of David Johns, either feeling cowed by the threats of violence or just wanting to keep the book on track, executed that penal bond that we talked about, conditioned on the payment of 1/4 share of the proceeds of the book. So unless Morgan received his money, the three partners would have to have made good on that huge penal bond at that time. And then on August 19th, another person sues Morgan, and he remains in jail again until Millers and others bailed him out. It's got to be at this point, the guys who are conspiring to get this thing published have got to really be wondering about their partner. And then we start to see on September 7th, we get denials that Morgan was ever a Mason. That's starting to happen. And eventually we get on September 10th, information gets filed with the Justice of the Peace of Canandaigua over a shirt and cravat that Morgan had borrowed and not returned to Mr. Kingland. So they arrest Morgan, and that warrant is given to Nicholas Chesborough, coroner of the county, and he gives it to a constable. The constable then travels to Batavia about 50 miles, arrests Morgan, and brings Morgan to Canandaigua on September 11th. Now, the Justice of the Peace then decides that the borrowing of the shirt and cravat was not enough to be larceny, and released Morgan. But Morgan owed a debt to an innkeeper, and so he gets arrested for that debt. He gets rendered to the Sheriff Israel Hall, and he's brought to the jail about 11 o'clock that night. So the evening of the 12th, Brother Lawton Lawson calls on Morgan at the jail. Sheriff Hall was out, but Mrs. Hall, the sheriff's wife, arranged for Lawson to talk to Morgan. And Mrs. Hall later says that she overheard Lawson ask Morgan if he'd go home with him if he paid the fine. Morgan said that he would. So Lawson offers to pay Morgan's debt, but Mrs. Hall refuses, that she doesn't want to do something that her husband wouldn't do. But Brother Nicholas Chesborough and Brother Ed Sawyer, a couple of prominent businessmen in Canandaigua, also arrive at the jail. They reassure Mrs. Hall they'd be all right to release Morgan, and they do so. So about 9 o'clock on a moonlit September night, Morgan's released with Lawson, Chesborough, and Sawyer. And as she locks the prison door, she hears the cry of murder once or twice and sees Morgan struggling between two men. She then sees a carriage pass by heading east, then going west, and the cries of murder are substantiated by Dr. Hall, who is a respected physician who's also in the area of the jail at the time. So they're heading out of town. They pick up a worshipful brother, John Whitney, who rides up with the driver to the town of Victor, where they stop and water the horses. Passengers get out to have a drink at the inn. They stop at Mendon and Pittsford to water the horses, but the passengers stay inside. They arrive at Rochester on the daybreak of the 13th. Carriage stops on a few miles on the other side of Rochester at a place called Hanford's Landing, where they then change carriages and drivers. They then take the Ridge Road, kind of along where the Erie Canal is being built, at about sundown, having changed horses at regular intervals along the way, where they arrive at another tavern 3 miles north of Lockport, where they are met by Sheriff Eli Bruce, who's the sheriff of Niagara County, and a group of about 50 Masons. And from this point forward, Sheriff Bruce has control of the party. So they then stop at another tavern near Lewiston, where a second carriage driver discharges his passenger, gets another carriage. They go to Youngstown and then to Colonel King's house, 6 miles out of Lewiston, where they proceed about a half mile to Fort Niagara, where they left the carriage and proceeded on foot to the fort. They then met up with Edward Giddings, who's the keeper of the lighthouse, and proceed across the river in a ferry boat to the Canadian side. But because they didn't find the folks that they expected to be there, they returned to Fort Niagara, and Morgan gets confined to the magazine. And that's where the confirmed trail stops. Everything else then becomes speculation. So that's the confirmed story of what happened.
Confirmed by who? By how? By stories and accusations and written.
Confirmed by all of the trials that occurred in Canandaigua over the next couple of years. There were several different trials that occurred for just about everybody that was involved, and a lot of these guys did hard prison time. Eli Bruce ends up no longer being the sheriff. He's deposed from being sheriff. Colonel King died before he could be brought to trial, but Bruce ends up spending some time in prison and ends up becoming a doctor after all of this stuff settles down. But he dies, I think, he dies of a disease just a few years later, and he was a pretty young guy, so really kind of tragic for him. Chesborough and Lawton Lawson and Ed Sawyer also end up going to prison for a number of years. So it's not a good thing. So there are some other things that happen, of course, too. You know, after there's the arson that they tried to do on September the 8th, which again was alleged to be staged by the publisher because of the barrels of water that were conveniently placed near to the shop. So Miller then, after that, fortifies his print shop up because he knows that the Masons are coming to try and stop the publication of this book. There ends up being a warrant sworn out for a debt of $40 by a man named Daniel Johns, who paid to secure an interest in the upcoming book. And so the warrant gets signed off by Justice Barton at nearby Leroy, and Constable French gets to serve it. So the sheriff gathers together a posse of guys to go and serve this warrant on these publishers. And so they've got clubs. They're all have fortified themselves with strong drink at Dan Old's Tavern. The people in the print shop have also fortified themselves with strong drink at another tavern. And so about 15 minutes go by where there's sort of this standoff, and there's the potential for real violence, right? If the sheriff was going to come in and serve these warrants on the publisher. But eventually just two of the guys from the sheriff's crew go in and they convince them to come quietly with them. And so they put Miller into a carriage and they end up going back to the tavern again, because apparently taverns are really important in upstate New York at this time. And so Davids ends up getting released because he's already under jail bond for a debt. He can't leave Batavia because he's already on bail for a debt. So he can't leave the city limits of Batavia. But Miller gets plopped into that carriage again. He's taken to Leroy, and they make it there. And due to the absence of the plaintiff in the matter, Miller ends up getting acquitted. So, but the fallout from all this is that Constable French, his assistant Wilcox, and one of the posse members, they eventually get indicted and tried in April 1827 for the riot, assault and battery, and false imprisonment of David Miller. French gets 12 months, Wilcox 6 months, and Hurlburt gets 3-month sentences, and Garrison ends up getting acquitted. But nobody can find where Morgan's at. So Morgan has disappeared from the magazine Niagara. So they start swearing out affidavits and start trials get scheduled in November of 1826 for brothers Chesborough, Lawson, and Sawyer. And although they initially enter a plea of not guilty, when the trial opened, they pled guilty. And evidence was given by Mrs. Hall, the jailer's wife, 2 of the carriage drivers, and others. Chesborough gets a year in prison, Lawton gets 2 years, and Edward Sawyer gets a month. And in announcing their sentences, of course, the judge excoriated a lot of them for the extrajudicial rendition of Morgan, but they're never convicted of murder. The charge of murder is never brought because they could not find a body. So there you go.
There's a lot of interesting Masonic connections to all these things. You know, as you just said, the body cannot be found, and then there's 3 of convictions and 3 inquisitions and 3 guys that started the whole thing. And it just, when I was watching on another YouTube channel, and I thought, is he just weaving this stuff into the story to make it sound Masonic? And I thought, wait a minute, no. And
Governor Clinton, who was a Mason, of course, and was in charge of just about everything at one time, in
past Grand Master, apparently, right?
Past Grand Master, past Grand Encampment. He's right up in New York, right, and all the stuff. He issues 3 separate proclamations: one on October 4th, one on October 26th, and one on March 19th of 1827, setting forth an escalating series of rewards that, if living, Morgan can be restored to his family, and if dead, he can be buried, and the instigators can be brought to punishment. And Masonic bodies everywhere just go, it ain't me, I didn't do it. So there are all these publications of sympathy and we didn't do it. Things like, here's the Grand Royal Arch Chapter of New York unanimously passed this resolution at the annual convocation in February of 1827. Resolved by this Grand Chapter that we, its members individually and as a body, do disclaim all knowledge or approbation of the proceedings in relation to the abduction of William Morgan, and that we disapprove of the same as a violation of the majesty of the laws and an infringement on the rights of personal liberty secured to every citizen of our free and happy republic. And similar resolutions get passed in most of the subordinate chapters in the state, also by many of the Blue Lodges. And then you start to really see the fervor and the hatred begin in earnest. In February 19th of 1827, there is a convention assembled at Leroy where 40 Masons, some say it was only 10 or 12, and some had been already expelled from the fraternity, said that Freemasonry was wicked, had murdered Morgan, and renounced the craft. By March 1827, the anti-Masonic committees that had been organizing at the county level met at Lewiston and vowed to drive Freemasonry from the land. And that starts to get kind of kindled and tended by political operators like Thurlow Weed. And Thurlow Weed was a newspaper publisher, and along with him and Solomon Southwick, they start to develop this anti-Masonic party. There would be a total of 19 anti-Masonic conventions held in the state of New York in 1827 alone. And then you start to get the churches get involved. Convention of Baptist Churches at Milton, Saratoga County in March. It's probably the first organized religious oppositions. But then Masons get put on these church trials for being Masons. You could be removed from the congregation for your Masonic affiliation. And the Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodists, and Congregationalists all readily took up this anti-Masonic further. There were a number of newspapers that appeared espousing anti-Masonic principles. There were 53 of them in Pennsylvania, 46 in New York, 4 in Vermont, and 9 in Ohio. Among the editors were Weed at his newly renamed Anti-Masonic Inquirer and Southwick at the National Observer in Albany. And there are some really terrible things that these guys are saying about the fraternity. And here's a doozy from the Southwick's his Observer. Anti-Masonry sprung from the throne of God, and under his almighty wings, it will conquer hell's masterpiece and redeem our country from vile slavery and galling chains, from eternal disgrace, from everlasting ruin and degradation. Just there's all sorts of scurrilous stuff that gets published. And then just to top it all off, in the middle of all the stuff that's going on, a body is finally found in October of 1827, 13 months after the disappearance of Morgan. So the corpse gets found in Oak Orchard Harbor, about 40 miles from Fort Niagara. The discoverers bring out the coroner and about 24 other citizens to act as witnesses to the operation. They pull a shutter off of a nearby barn, put the body on top of it at low tide, carry it up to the bank. It's not in good condition. Those reportedly who were nearby, including the coroner, lost the contents of their stomachs to the sight and the odor. Still, the autopsy proceeds. So this is what the autopsy says. Length of corpse is 5 foot 10 inches. No scars noticeable in the condition of the flesh. A man about 46 years of age. Remains of heavy whisker and thick hair over the head. Teeth sound, nothing remarkable about them. The two potters who first discovered the body and were well acquainted with William Morgan testified the corpse has no resemblance by which they should recognize Morgan. Clothing, etc., fully described. In one of the pockets, a package of religious tracts. Verdict found drowned, clothes, etc., carefully dried and placed in the hands of the magistrate at Carleton, 6 miles distance. Coffin procured, body decently shrouded and interred. So Thurlow Weed sees the coroner's notice, and he puts together a party of men, including Morgan's old partners, Russell Dyer and David Miller, and they meet at the grave on October 13th to raise the body, and they disinter it. And they take it up to Carleton and they have it examined. Now, Mrs. Morgan, Lucinda, is sent for, and the second inquest was held the following Monday. The body was now black, bloated, putrid, and offensive beyond anything conceivable. The head is now nearly bald and only has a few tufts of hair that could be seen. Whiskers had disappeared, but the ears and nostrils now sported long white hairs. Mrs. Morgan identifies the body as that of her husband, William. The body is taken to Batavia and buried on October 19th. On returning from the inquest, Weed has an exchange with a rival newspaper editor, a man by the name of O'Reilly, who asked him, "Well, Weed, have you manufactured the body in the Morgans?" Weed replied, "I guess you'll find it a good enough Morgan until after the election." So there you go. So meanwhile, in Canada, Timothy Monroe had been missing since September 24th, having left Newcastle for Fort Orange on the American shore, but on returning, his boat tipped over and he drowned. A search had been made, but the body was not recovered. Mrs. Monroe goes to Carleton, where the clothes were kept, and is able to describe without seeing them how the stocking and clothes had been mended, how one leg of the pants is longer than the other, how the pockets were lined, and the minutest marks upon them. Third jury is impaneled in Batavia on October 29th, and the corpse again exhumed. Those that testify included those who saw the body when it first came out of the water, testified to the hair on the head and the whiskers on the face, and the corpse was again measured at 5'9", and if properly stretched out would be 5'11". State of decomposition was also noted not to be so advanced as to be more than 2 months dead, and the differences here are obvious. The corpse is taller than Morgan by 3 to 4 inches, had a full head of hair while Morgan was bald, and only been dead for a couple of months while Morgan disappeared more than a year ago. So it was definitively determined to be that of Timothy Monroe and subsequently brought back to Canada and interred. So there you go. It wasn't really Morgan.
Who cares?
But who cares, right? Yes. It's good enough until after the election, which was something.
Jeremy, I was going to ask, like the anti, within a year, this thing had snowballed out of control. Had there been in New York or in the United States generally an anti-Masonic movement of any sort before the Morgan affair?
Well, I think there had always been, and especially at this time, because there was like this whole spiritual revivalism period occurred called the Second Great Awakening. had occurred throughout upstate New York and down further into the Tennessee Valley. It had all these tent revivals that went through the area. And there were, just like there's anti-Catholicism during this period of time, there's also this anti-Masonic thing because people were seeing Masonry as a substitute for the church. And there were rumors about the obligations that Masons took. And there was also some temperance was being argued for social reform. And it tended to occur that as lodges opened up, and there were a lot of lodges opening up as Masonry was expanding, that every time a lodge opened up, the receipts for intoxicating liquors also correspondingly went up because table lodges are important, right? So there were some festive boards that were occurring. So there were certainly some anti-Masonic feelings, I think, that were bubbling up through the community. And plus, you had awful lot of Masons that were in positions of power. All those people that I had mentioned, the sheriff of Niagara County, Governor Clinton. You had several Masons at the national level, including Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay. Although they didn't like each other, they were both past Grand Masters. So there's all kinds of all these Masons are in these positions of power, and I think there is some. If we can take these guys down a peg, what if you could wipe out an entire class of people, and then you could fill that space, because nature abhors a vacuum in business and in politics and in religion. So if you can insert yourself by taking down these other guys, yeah, I think that was a thing.
Mm-hmm. Plus, it also seems too, with these conventions, these newspapers, there's an opportunity to get in and make money off of it too.
Absolutely, 100%, 100%. So if we wanted to talk about some of the anti-Masonic party, it wasn't long before the anti-Masonic movement was harnessed for political gain. So there were all these resolutions coming out of the conventions decrying that no Mason should be in any office anywhere. It's a short hop to formulate a slate of candidates to replace those Masonic scoundrels. And Jackson, who was an unabashed Mason, was their ultimate target. In fact, the anti-Masons tried to convince past Grand Master Henry Clay of Kentucky to renounce the fraternity in 1827 and run as an anti-Masonic candidate, but most Worshipful Brother Clay refused. Still, they're a powerful group, and they include folks like William Seward, right, the guy who purchased the Alaska, Millard Fillmore, and even the old Federalist turned Democratic Republican turned anti-Mason John Quincy Adams. So all of those guys. And in 1828, you've got Congress gets divided into the Jacksonian Democrats and the anti-Jacksonians. The anti-Masonic party runs several candidates for the House and manages to actually win 5 seats in the Congress, the first on their national stage. Jacksonian Democrats are still the clear winner with 136 representatives there, so they're gaining 23 seats from 1826. Anti-Jacksonians end up with 72, which loses 28 seats from the previous election. In 1830, the anti-Masons pick up 12 more seats for a total of 17, but Jackson still has the clear majority with 126, anti-Jacksonian 66, and the states' right group called the Nullifiers end up with 4. In 1832, we kind of get the zenith of the anti-Masonic party, and they even run a presidential candidate, William Wirt, who is a really interesting guy. He's a great attorney general, and he actually is sort of picked by Jefferson as a future colossus in American politics, but he never quite gets there. And he is, in fact, himself, he is a Mason. And he wins the nomination at a presidential nominating convention in Boston's Faneuil Hall in 1830, which was the first nominating convention held by a national political party, is the anti-Masonic party, the first one. Wirt goes on in his acceptance speech to tell the crowd that he found Freemasonry unobjectionable, and that in his experience, many Masons were intelligent men of high and honorable character who would never choose Freemasonry above their duties to God and country. And he ends up taking like 6.8% of the popular vote, and he wins the state of Vermont. So, and then they picked up 8 seats in the House of Representatives. But then the anti-Masonic party goes on a steady downhill climb or downhill descent. They have a real hard time in the convention of 1835 who to decide who's going to run on the national ticket. in 1836, they inquire as to whether or not William Henry Harrison would be a suitable candidate, but they can't get Harrison to tell them whether or not he's a Mason. So they end up without a candidate, and they resolve to take up the matter in 1837 and talk about the future of their party. And by that time, most of the anti-Masons adopted the Whig Party as the leading alternative to the Jacksonian Democrats. So in their final nominating convention in 1838, they do go on to nominate Harrison as their candidate for president, with Daniel Webster as the vice presidential choice. But the Whigs claim Harrison as their nominee, and the party gets absorbed by the Whigs by 1840. So, but we get several things from the anti-Masons politically: the direct appeal to the popular vote, communication via mass media, newspapers. They have big rallies and conventions. All those get folded into national politics as we come to know it today. So, and then just when we think we've seen the last of the anti-Masonic movement here in like the 1840s, it gets resurrected by the National Christian Association and abolitionist John Blanchard. And it lasts for about 10 years. And this is like in the 1880s-ish, 1870s, 1880s time period. And they espouse Christianity, temperance, and the abolition of secret societies, and the abolition of the Electoral College. And they raise funds to commemorate their hero, William Morgan. And so they have this statue of an idealized Morgan raised in the Batavia Cemetery, which is ironically at the very spot where Weed had put the body of the good enough Morgan that had been buried 55 years before. So anyway, he is the tallest man in the Batavia Cemetery. I don't know if I can share my screen, but I want to show you guys this if I can. Oh, you disabled screen sharing.
If
Unmute, Matt.
somebody wants to go looking for it, there's a couple of videos on YouTube that actually have discussion about the tallest man in Batavia and have really good video as part of it. If someone just searches Morgan Affair on YouTube, they'll come up with it.
I have it pulled up on Google Maps. You can do the street view, and you can get a pretty, well, here we go. Pretty good view of it. Let's see if I can share my screen. Oops. Go away.
This is a cheap ploy for those that aren't watching video to go to YouTube. Or if you're on Spotify, you can actually watch the video on Spotify as well. So
here he is.
Turn your phone on.
Here is Sacred to the Memory of W.M. Morgan. And he is the tallest man in the Batavia Cemetery. And, the thing is with, this had lasting impacts. Let's stop screen sharing. I'm so used to Teams. This has lasting impacts to Freemasonry, of course, because we have a lot of lodges that end up going out of existence. For a while, the Grand Lodge of, let's see here, the Grand Lodge of Vermont ends up just turning off. They don't meet at all.
And the Grand Lodge closed too, right?
I'm sorry?
The Grand Lodge essentially closed in Vermont.
Yeah, the Grand Lodge absolutely closed.
And Illinois.
I read an anecdote about that said that there was a couple of the Grand Lodge officers that would meet periodically, sit together, light a candle, and just kind of wait until a time that they could start to reorganize Freemasonry in Vermont. It effectively was out of existence for a number of years.
That's right. In New York, they went from 227 lodges in 1825 to 49 lodges in 1835. In Vermont, everything closed. All lodges closed and became dormant. The Grand Lodge ceased to hold sessions for several years, and the Grand Line had to stay in place for 10 years. Maine's Grand Lodge failed to meet for several years, and from 1834 to 43, their annual communication met once with no constituent lodges, and only had representatives from more than 4 lodges twice. And Masonry still continued and still survived. There were stalwarts. Olive Branch Lodge number 39 in New York persisted, and is regarded as the parent and preserver of Masonry in Western New York. 7 of the most zealous and stalwart members entered into a solemn agreement to meet once every 4 weeks to open the lodge and keep up the work. Ark Lodge number 33 in Geneva, Ontario County, had 7 members who never surrendered. They'd take back roads and by lanes to get to lodge, and then one by one at odd intervals, they'd enter through the back door to get into the lodge. So it's a real thing. And you know, if you go out to the Grand Lodge site of New York, even today, there's no lodge in Batavia. 200 years later. So yeah, there's real harm done. Lives are literally ruined. Eli Bruce, again, the sheriff, was in his 30s when he was the sheriff, in prison for 28 months. After he was released, he becomes a doctor in his hometown of Lewiston, but dies of cholera after just 1 year at the age of 39. And Brother Nicholas Chesborough, who served his time quietly and then eventually worked in the Postal Service. You can go out on Find a Grave and find his tombstone. There is no square and compass or any Masonic emblem on his gravestone. So
first of all, 2 quick things I wanted to say. Your trivia for the day is that the only third party, since this is an election year, in the United States to ever carry a state in the presidential election in the Electoral College is the Anti-Masonic Party, which is a nugget of trivia that my children got to truck out in history class one time when the teacher asked them.
Pretty cool.
I taught them that much at least. And the other item is, I wanted to ask, since we're running short of time, but I feel like we're close to wrapping up the affair part of this. What happened to Morgan's wife after his disappearance? Do we have a?
She ends up marrying a
Mason
who had been expelled.
I was kidding.
She ends up marrying a Mason who had been expelled. She also ends up later on getting sealed to Joseph Smith, because of course Mormonism also starts to come into its fore as Smith has his visions in nearby Palmyra. There's a lot of stuff happening in upstate New York. It was kind of a spooky place to be. In fact, Morgan himself is one of the very first people to undergo the Mormon rite of baptism after death. Where they do the thing. And so she ends up being a sealed wife to Joseph Smith. At least that's what's alleged.
As if by magic.
Yeah. And of course, for everybody else's, they're in response to the second anti-Masonic movement. Brother Grandmaster Rob Morris from Kentucky, right? Who of course wrote the Ritual for the Eastern Star, writes a book about the anti-Masonic movement and sort of explains the true story of what happened to William Morgan. And it's alleged that they offered Morgan the chance to either have his family sent with him to go to Canada with land on a farm, and he could just go up there and not be involved in the publication of this stuff, or $500 worth of golden horse. And Morgan allegedly took the $500 with gold and horse and disappeared. So there are numerous post disappearance sightings of someone alleged to be Morgan, from sea captains to pirates to all sorts of hermits that live off the grid.
Rum makers.
Yeah, troublemakers.
Rum makers.
Maybe.
Do you have any background on the St. John's Day attack?
Just that the lodge ends up being ransacked on St. John's Day. The jewels of the lodge end up, I believe, in Michigan by a brother. I think it's Michigan, who by a brother, and you can see them out on the Grand Lodge of Michigan's library website. Has got the jewels for Batavia 433 by a brother who fled there, seeking to continue Masonry further west as the frontier continues to push west. And it's fascinating because, a lot of the Freemasons that come out west in the Go West Young Man 1940 or 1849, 1850 kind of era, there's a ton of Masons that go to the west, perhaps still feeling some of the pressure of the anti-Masonic movement.
One of the things I've been given to understand, Jeremy, is that it had a profound impact on Masonry itself afterwards. And what I mean by that, like the entire form of American Masonic ritual was altered in the wake of the Morgan affair. Many places in the world you have well, there was a requirement that everything be done in the Master Mason degree in lodge. I think a lot of the requirements for temperance in lodges, why lodges went dry. I don't know if that happened here or if that was later as a result of prohibition, but I think this certainly had an influence on it. Certainly, we discussed already how the tavern seemed to play a rather important part in this narrative. But yeah, a lot of the secrecy or surrounding Masonry became much more. It was much less open than it had been. It was, and these things continue to this day. If I'm grasping a little bit there, but that's some of the things. A couple of references I've read in other books about the Morgan affair said that there was drastic changes to the way that Masons conducted themselves in and out of lodge after all this happened.
Absolutely. I know that for my lodge, the earliest copy of our bylaws that we have, there's certainly a lot of emphasis on temperance and sobriety was emphasized, and you couldn't even be seen coming out of a saloon or a tavern or a bar. That was grounds for being suspended or expelled.
What year was Stillicum chartered?
Stillicum was chartered in 1854, but
54,
our
okay.
lodge burned down in 1868, and so our oldest bylaws that we have in existence are from 1868, and there are sections in the bylaws that deal with it.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, thank you for this. This has been fascinating and just scratching the surface really too, though.
There's a ton there. If you look at gosh, just even the elections in 1826 and before, when Clay and Jackson and all the other folks are all vying for, and Adams, they're all vying for the presidency, and the corrupt bargain that was struck. It's just fascinating, how past grandmasters from different states can have that same Masonic mystic tie and absolutely hate one another. So
All right. So with that, it seems that we've unfortunately run out of time yet again on our show here tonight. So I want to thank our guest again, Jeremy, and I encourage all of our listeners/viewers to go and check out the links to his YouTube presentations. There's, as he said earlier, they're long enough that there is more information there than we discuss here. So thank you again, Jeremy, for being on the show.
thank you, guys. I hope I was coherent enough.
Well,
that was excellent.
You exceed our standard, but that's pretty low. But you definitely
appreciate the opportunity to participate. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, on behalf of David and Craig and the absent Stephen and myself, thank you, Jeremy, for being here, and thank you all for listening to the Working Tools podcast. Goodbye.